Okay, hi everyone again, and welcome to Simply Neuroscience's third focus group session from the Neuroscience and Society Department. The goal of the Neuroscience and Society is to focus on the intersections between society, public policy, neuroscience, and all these different intersections that are quite fascinating and increasingly relevant in society today. So today we have three panelists here that are um, interested and going to share their very interesting research and work into this field of neuroscience, public policy, and all these interconnected areas. So before they begin their talking about their work, I'll give a brief introduction about each of them. So Marissa C. Ross joined the Neuroscience and Public Policy program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison after completing her bachelor's degree in biology and psychology. And also she completed a master's of public affairs from the UW-Madison 2019. And she's currently pursuing her doctoral candidate in neuroscience. She's received various recognitions for her work, including the Ruth L. Kirstein National Service Award from the National Institute of Mental Health for her research into characterizing novel resting state models for PTSD and early life trauma in women, and various other research experiences as well. And we're looking forward to hearing from her in this session. Next, we have Josh Cruz, who is a graduate student at the Neuroscience Public Policy program. And his research interests are focused on the neural mechanisms of emotion regulation and executive function in childhood and adolescence, and how these developments of impairments can contribute to problems like psychopathy in adulthood. He uses techniques including MRI and other types of neural imaging techniques to measure these types of conditions and quantify them in his research. He's also received various recognitions and has other experiences as well, including being a graduate of the Robert M. La Follette School of Public Affairs, and is excited to share his work today as well. We also have Claire Erickson, who's a fourth year in the Neuroscience and Public Policy program at the UW-Madison. Her research work is conducted at the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, and her work focuses on the modifiable factors in cognitive decline and the disclosure of Alzheimer's biomarkers to cognitively healthy adults. In the future, she hopes to use her MPA and PhD degrees to work in long-term care and aging policy. So we're very excited to have you all here today. And without further ado, we welcome you to start your panel and talk about your work and experiences. So I think first, first off, I guess we can go around, and if you want to introduce yourselves, any other information you want to provide.
I guess I'll go first, since usually we get the these types of panels, usually the most senior in the program. So yeah, thanks for the introduction, Arvind. Like we said, my name's Josh. I'm about to be finishing up my PhD in the Neuroscience Public Policy program this summer. I'm originally from California also, so I went to UC Davis, so the neurobio major. Originally wanted to go to medical school, but then kind of had my gap year before, it ended up being 3 years. I was a gap year before grad school, and then switching paths and going into the PhD realm, and then kind of added on the policy whilst I was doing that as well. So I don't know, how should I say this? So yeah, so I mean, I guess my pathway into neuroscience and public policy really was kind of the first initial research experience while I was at Davis. I worked in a lab that studied kind of also risk factors for schizophrenia risk and a specific genetic disorder called chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, which is quite the mouthful. But I really got to see the kind of intersection between not only like the clinical world and like pediatricians, doctors, geneticists, as well as researchers, but how that kind of interacts with policy making process, or like the things that support those with like intellectual disability. And so during my time before grad school, I spent a lot of time working with families with kids with special needs who were not only looking to provide answers for their child's kind of developmental issues, delays, but also kind of how to kind of raise them in this very unsure world of like, how do you get like education plans? How does that interact with, if they were kind of in this kind of lower socioeconomic demographic, like how could they kind of afford to provide their child with the necessary kind of services that would provide them the best life. And so I think I really kind of enjoyed the kind of that intersection between not only just kind of clinical research, but how you can provide like, stuff that's non-biology related to development of the mental health in not only individuals with like special needs, which is what I originally started with, but then eventually kind of looked at the whole society and how you kind of support mental health programs to kind of, be more than just biology, but just be more than just the clinic, and just, how to use policy to support that.
So I'm, I guess, the next senior. Thank you for the introduction. My name's Marisa. I am also planning on defending my dissertation and graduating this summer. So wrapping up my time in the Neuroscience and Public Policy program. So my journey here, I guess, as Josh kind of set the precedent, so that's what we'll be saying. I did my undergraduate degrees at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, graduated in 2016. About halfway through my degree, I knew I was interested in science. I knew I was interested in psychology, but I also was not fulfilled enough by just studying those two things. I wanted to do something bigger with my scientific research, whatever that ended up being. And I was initially very interested in the effects of socioeconomic factors on brain development from an internship that I had in my undergraduate. And when I decided to apply to graduate schools, there was lots of that type of research here at UW, as well as the Neuroscience and Public Policy program that was designed to sort of integrate these types of bigger world questions with rigorous neuroscience research. And so I ended up here. I am currently studying post-traumatic stress disorder in women and girls with interpersonal violence exposure. And trauma is one of those things that is a traumatic experience can affect every aspect of an individual's life, and that could include every aspect of interactions with the criminal justice system, with social services, with academic and educational services. So studying something like trauma and applying that to policy, I feel is extremely relevant. It's something that I hope to do in the next stage of my career, whatever that is, and continue to just think about how what we can do in strict scientific research and how we can expand that out to make the world a kinder, more scientifically informed place, sort of my general mindset.
I think all of us in this program have a very similar story. We have different trajectories and we have different catalyzing events and different things that we're motivated by, but I think the underlying themes are all very similar. So I'm going to echo what Josh and Marisa have shared about their own stories. I'm going to take us back to my high school years. I, like a lot of people interested in the sciences, I think, want to pursue a career in medicine. And I was one of those people, thought I wanted to go to med school and become a physician. And my sister graduated pharmacy school when I was at the end of my junior year of high school. And I don't even remember the thought process behind me doing this, but I reached out to the director of essentially the neuroscience department at University of Iowa, which is where my sister had gotten her pharmacy degree from. And for some reason, he was like, sure, like, let's talk. So I was like, I'm going to be in town, for this period of time. Do you have time to meet with me? And he's like, yeah, here's my secretary, find a time. And so he did, which now, like, looking back and understanding, like, I know who this man is now in the context of what his work is and his just time restraints and having a better grasp of academia. I'm like, oh my God, why was he meeting with with me as like a 16-year-old? It's fine. And it was great. And, I talked about my interest in neuroscience. I had known that neuroscience was what I wanted to pursue in undergrad, but wasn't really sure post-undergrad what I wanted to do. I was pretty sure I wanted to go to more school. It's just like what that school was going to look like. And we talked about my interests in neurodegeneration and Alzheimer's and kind of what my ideas were. And he essentially said to me, we need people like you not to go into medicine, but to go into a PhD program, because being in medicine is a more prescriptive way of doing things. And certainly the PhD is as well, although there is, I will say from my experiences, knowing a lot of people who are in med school, we do have a lot more flexibility in what our education looks like and what kind of career development opportunities we get within graduate school as opposed to medical school. And so that was really a catalyzing event that shifted what I envisioned for myself. And so I went to Ohio State for undergrad. I studied neuroscience and Spanish, and was thinking to myself, I think I want to do a PhD in neuroscience. I got involved in research my first year at Ohio State, and pretty quickly realized like I really enjoyed the work. I worked in a smaller lab, so I had a lot of access to my PI. And he and I had very candid conversations about what it looks like being an academic researcher and what that means as a career, and to have your own lab and all of the intricate details that go into that, which I feel very lucky because I figured out pretty quickly that that was not what I wanted to do. And so I kind of had this existential crisis again, where I was like, oh God, like, what do I want to do if it's not medicine? And if I don't want to use a PhD to be a PI at a research institute conducting research and having my own lab, what am I going to do? What do I do with a PhD if not that? And that opened up an entirely new can of worms, which we're still on the track of, starting to open that can of worms. And I had been interested in the University of Wisconsin for graduate school anyway, and in the neuroscience program. And somehow that's how I found the neuroscience and public policy program, which was kind of just serendipitous there. And then in random of all random events, my roommate and good friend from undergrad worked in a lab with Marisa's mom, like this Marisa, which is so bizarre. And so, my roommate connected me with Marisa through her mom. And so we got to talk about the program, and it was just really, it feels like being able to have talked about it. And when I found this program and was reading about it, it just really felt right to me. I was like, I feel like I'm finally getting to be true to me, because I've always felt like a science kid, but that there was something always kind of nagging me in that that wasn't totally fulfilling. And in high school, I really loved my, civics oriented courses and classes, and, volunteering has always been really important to me. And so finding this bigger purpose in science opposed to just what the bench work is, as opposed to just publishing. And so I really set my sights on the neuroscience and public policy program. And here we are, however many years later, I don't want to count, it's fine. And it's just been absolutely phenomenal. I work at one of 32 NIH-funded Alzheimer's disease research centers, and we focus on preclinical Alzheimer's disease. So this is the phase of disease before individuals have symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. And we are most interested in being able to identify people who are most at risk for going on to develop Alzheimer's disease. And it has just been really incredible to get to integrate the policy work that we do through our master's program with the science that we're doing. The center I work with is very engaged with the community, and my mentor is incredibly encouraging and supportive of the dual degree program, and really pursuing opportunities that get to blend this kind of policy with the science. I'll stop there.
Yeah, it sounds like you all have really fascinating and like diverse backgrounds. We normally stereotype neuroscience as one particular thing, but as you all touched upon, it's definitely much more diverse than we normally perceive it to be. So I think the first topic that we'll touch upon is the connection between public policy and neuroscience that you obviously all have a very deep background in. So how do you think that policy in particular can be made and be constructed itself in a more scientific way? How can, especially things like healthcare policy, like climate change policy, all of those things be addressed in a more scientific way? Like, what do you think are the best solutions to bring more science into public policy?
I think one of the biggest things is looking at who's in the room for decision making, and to hopefully not be too old, taking off of Hamilton, right? The room where it happens, and thinking about who is in the room where these things happen and who's making decisions. And it's important to have, when we talk about stakeholders, right? And stakeholders are different groups or individuals that have a stake to claim in an issue. And so, you can have all different kinds of stakeholders. Stakeholders can be people who are funding certain things and have an economic interest in what's going on. So with regards to climate change, a stakeholder is certainly the car industry, the energy, sector, but stakeholders are also community people who are being affected by whatever is happening, and then experts. And so I think it is in recognizing that an expert's role is not just in providing information. I think when we think about scientists, it's about cultivating knowledge. And to me, a scientist's job doesn't end, and the responsibility doesn't end at just cultivating knowledge. It's really about disseminating it and being able to spread it and leverage it in a way that's going to be useful. Because one of the themes that I think will likely come out of this panel today, that I think, Marisa, I'm thinking about your internship, to hopefully not give any spoilers, but that's what I'm thinking of right now, that if we're not the ones that are being utilized with our expertise to come into a room and talk about something, somebody else who does not have the same expertise and likely has a different agenda will be. And so, that space is going to be occupied by somebody. And making sure that scientists are in the room, and scientists who are trained and have a motivation to be involved in this. And so I kind of see it from two sides of things, right? On one side, it is ensuring that policymakers include scientists in the process, but it's also equipping scientists to feel capable of doing this and developing a skill set to do it as well. So approaching it from two sides.
Yeah, I think, oh, yeah, go ahead, Marissa.
Oh, sure. I was just going to add to that. Most of us, I think, when we end up working in science, if we end up working in science policy, we're not going to be working in neuroscience policy. We're probably going to be working in a whole wide range of issues in policy that science might touch. And so I think that using the scientific method, having sort of a scientific, rigorous, critical thinking approach applied to the policymaking process is really where scientists can make a big difference. So we're trained during our PhDs to ask the unanswerable questions, figure out how to test those questions, how to evaluate those questions, and how to communicate that. And all of those things can also be applied to policy problems, even if it's not specifically climate change. It could be housing, it could be food insecurity, it could be international relations issues. All of that can be evaluated appropriately using the scientific process.
Yeah, so I noticed a lot of you, you touched upon the fact about having stakeholders in the room, and I think that's very important. We often think that only politicians have to make the decisions, but that's not true. With things like healthcare, especially climate change, all these things affect all of us. It's not just one particular industry or one particular sector of the population. And I think it's important to have all the stakeholders in the room, as you mentioned. And specifically, like honing upon the topic of healthcare policy, I think one important issue right now is that people think of healthcare policy from a profit standpoint. They think, how can we reduce costs? How can we make it more efficient from a monetary standpoint? How do you think that we can switch the standpoint from a monetary focus to a well-being focus, and like focusing on the well-being of patients and better healthcare outcomes rather than maximizing profits or maximizing monetary gains of these insurance companies?
I have some thoughts on this, but Josh, would you like to, before I jump right in, do you have any thoughts that are coming to your mind first?
I mean, like, this is like the whole healthcare issue in the U.S. is such a a juggernaut issue because it's so complicated. And then, of course, like, I think the trend nowadays is in medicine is to do like, okay, well, right now our healthcare system's kind of living off of these high profit procedures, medications, things like that, because it's more treated as like a treatment approach to medicine as opposed to a preventative one. Okay.
Fee for service model is
fee for service model, yeah. And so I think what people kind of are afraid of, if you're going to try to change it to this kind of preventive model, that, well, I mean, then companies won't be making as much money because like they can't charge and like and so on and so forth. So I mean, I don't not to like put my own political things in the mix, but like yeah, like it's kind of insane that we have like a profit building model off medicine, like to treat sick people, that you want to kind of like get every dollar out of them. And I think like, yes, like that's like more like radical way of thinking about medicine, is to kind of have everything being kind of supported by everyone. And but there is like benefits to industry in medicine, like with the development of like different vaccines and things like that. But I think there's also a way that we could build like an economic model to actually have something that's more like equally profitable to kind of everyone. So not kind of screwing over patients to like, spend thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars for like, like a 4-day, 1-week hospital visit, but also like ensure that, we have a developing workforce. You have, I don't know, I'm kind of putting my foot in my mouth regarding like how I'm explaining this, but yeah, I'll kind of like, maybe I'll Claire jump in and
to save the day. Here we go. Yeah, I think exactly to Josh's point with healthcare in the United States, it started in most systems, because I'm also comparing this to the long-term care model that we have in the United States as well. These systems get built out of extreme need, and then we only continue building on top of something that has a very unstable foundation, and we don't take the time to restructure and take a look at that foundation before we continue building on it. And that's why we are in such a complicated system right now. And I think there are a few things that stand out in answering this question. One is with hospital administration. And when you look at both healthcare insurance and then the actual running of hospitals itself, typically the highest paid person in a hospital is the administrator. It's the person who is in charge of the hospital. But those positions really didn't exist before like sometime in the 80s. And that has just exploded. And that is also where most costs go. And the goal and the what the job is for somebody who's a hospital administrator is essentially to get funding for the hospital and to make sure, right, to operate it as a business. And exactly to what Josh said, thinking about profitability in medicine is really gross. Like if you think about what medicine really is built to do, and when you talk to people who are interested in going into medicine, it's to help people, right? And yet a lot of what doctors do is dealing with the bureaucracy and is also this fee for service type model, which it does not make people healthier. And here in the United States, we spend so much on individuals for care, and yet we do not have better health outcomes. And so spending money, throwing money at a problem doesn't always make it better. And I think to also, because I think there are a couple of ways to think about costs, like in the healthcare system, I think that economic arguments and politics are, as of right now, the strongest arguments you can make. If you can talk about reducing budgets, you're going to get something passed, right? It's hard to ask for additional money for something, but it's easy to be like, okay, we're restructuring this to look this way. And I think that there is an argument within reducing the costs of healthcare overall to these systems. Medicare and Medicaid are huge payers of a lot of healthcare for Americans, and those are federally and state-run programs. And then within that is when you can, we talk about policy windows where these things come together to then open up the avenue for policy change to happen. So in utilizing the economic driven model for change by reducing these costs, you then open up an avenue to reassess what the priorities of medicine are. And that could potentially open up a window for the priority to then be on metrics of well-being as opposed to profitability. I will say this is the United States, and I think that will always be a component to industry, and healthcare is an industry and is a very large and profitable industry for a lot of big players, and change is going to be hard. Do you have something to add to that, Josh? No. I don't know if you came off of mute or
yeah.
yeah.
Oh no, I just had to get the one. Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to especially because it's grown so big. It's really, really hard to take down something that's so built off a foundation of money. There needs to be a whole type of kind of shift in how we view healthcare and how we kind of, think about, what is actually equitable to people. I mean, I don't know. Yeah. Marisa had something to say.
What you're both speaking to and the issue with healthcare generally, I think is an issue that is of concern for anyone who's trying to work in the policy space, and that's knowing your audience. So if you are working with an audience who cares about costs, you talk about costs. in terms of what your data show, what your analysis shows. If you think the best way to reduce cost is to do this, and you think that's going to work on your audience, that's the angle that you take. If you're talking with an audience who does care more about well-being than they do about cost, then you present your analyses in that sense. And this is not just in the healthcare space. So unfortunately, like Claire said, I do think that cost is always going to be a primary concern, but to whom that cost is put upon is also a part of that question. Is it on the patient? Is it on the provider? Is it on the hospital system? Is it on Medicare, Medicaid? So there's so many different layers to that. And just navigating, knowing based on who your audience is will make a much bigger impact than a blanket statement about something that your audience doesn't care about.
Yeah, those are all really good points. I think you mentioned the concept of preventative care and how that's a big factor in potentially improving healthcare outcomes and obviously also reducing costs as well. But I think a big problem right now is that seeking preventative care is not incentivized, because for people who are not on insurance plans or not sufficient insurance plans, they just wait until their situation gets so bad that they just go to the emergency room and then they have to get treatment by the law. So how do you think that we can incentivize getting preventative care and also increase the availability of preventative care? Like, do you think mobile health clinics in big cities, or what do you think potential solutions are on that front?
I don't think there's a one size fit all answer to that, because I think that is really community driven. And I think that also speaks to a lot of other policy issues where, depending on the community you're serving, again, talking about stakeholders and who's in the room, you need to have people who are going to be affected by the policies or by, whatever kind of new program you're implementing to really, is this going to help? And if it's not, what can we do? We have these resources and we would like to help. How can we be useful, and how can we ensure that services get used? One of the things, the only thing that I want to touch on here is I think that there needs to be a shift when we talk about like personal responsibility, because a lot of times in healthcare, we place blame on an individual, and it is their choices that lead to different health outcomes, right? Whether we're talking about diabetes, cancer, people also, to your point of delaying seeking healthcare before it actually is then an emergency and they have to seek healthcare. There's a lot of shame and blame that gets put of like, why did you wait this long to come in? And I think that there needs to be a shift in how we think about that, because shame is never going to get people to do things. It just isn't. And we've seen that time and time again, I think in, particularly in the last year with the pandemic, trying to shame somebody into doing something doesn't work. And so being able to take a nuanced approach and discussion of, here are why these things are so hard, or why, it feels so difficult to seek out a doctor. For various reasons, and again, it being community driven, because it's going to look different depending on where you are in the US, with what communities you are interfacing with, as well as like what kind of healthcare you're talking about, because when you're talking about a rural area, the needs are going to be very different than in an urban area, as well as the different factors at play. So I think shifting the conversation in a way that does not put individual blame on people is also a starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. Engaging with the community is the only way to do this effectively. Because one example that I think about a lot is the idea of making sure people get regular exercise, making sure people spend time outside. If you live in a community where the air is polluted, or where there's a lot of violence, or it's not safe to be outside, that's just not possible. And so it's really involved partnering with the community, the public agencies partnering with the community to figure out where they are needed, looking at centralized points within the community. That might be a public school, that might be a community center, a library, sort of leveraging public institutions within the community that lots of people use. You could maybe set up a mobile clinic there, or a pop-up clinic or something like that. Churches, temples, synagogues, like all types of religious institutions, and being it in a place where people are comfortable, and involving the individuals in that community in care. So not just sending in a bunch of white doctors to a Black community and saying, you need to take better care of yourself, but actually engaging with the healthcare providers in that community to help that community. So as Claire said, it's going to be different for every point and for every healthcare behavior that you're trying to incentivize, but it's impossible to do in an equitable and fair way without actually thinking about who you should involve.
I think in talking about community-driven work, I agree with everything you just said, Marisa. There are a lot of organizations on the ground already doing stuff that have trust in the community, have a pulse on what's going on. And so identifying those groups who are already doing the work, because a lot of times you're not going to have a new idea. Somebody's already thought about it. Somebody's already doing it. And so being able to connect with those people, and again, saying, I have resources and I have, whatever those resources look like. It's typically money, time, and, other people, to come in. And instead of coming in and being like, okay, this is how I'm going to help, coming in from an approach of, I would like to help, but I'm here for you. And so what can I do that, you're already established here, and have connections, because those are also going to be the people who can, grassroots organize, right? And get people to actually show up, because they already have pre-established relationships with the community, and also will have longstanding relationships after this event takes place. Because that's another thing, right? Is that it's not just about doing a one-time thing. That doesn't really work for people. That's not going to continue to cultivate trust. And it's like, okay, well, you're here for this one thing, and then what? Like what happens in 6 months when I need you again? Are you going to be here? And so thinking about that as well.
Yeah, I think all of those are really great points. I think the concept of community-based healthcare is something that's not as focused as much, but it's one of the biggest potential solutions that we can have, because right now healthcare seems to be driven by like multinational companies or like big companies that don't really have a root in the communities that they're serving. So I think identifying those organizations that are doing those actions and supporting them is a good point and a good way to help, as you mentioned.
I think in that too, it is a pretty, like, it sounds like a pretty solution, but what's difficult about it is this is not something that can be federally implemented. This is, again, not a one size fit all solution. And that's where it becomes difficult to then, okay, effectively, how do you actually do this then? Because this is going to look so different regionally, as well as specifically within subregions, across the different parts of the US. And so it's not an easy sell, because it requires much more specificity than a lot of the healthcare takes have right now, because they are these kind of blanket approaches and are made up of giant conglomerates.
And to kind of like, kind of wrap the point that's kind of separate, to go back to your original thing about, how do you kind of approach preventative medicine? You're starting to see that nowadays too, that there is a shift towards like preventative medicine. You see a lot of like insurance companies. I know at least with UW, health insurance, the one that students usually have here, they give like incentives to actually exercise, to do these kinds of things. And if you look at more from like an economic like externalities issue too, like it's actually an economic benefit for them to kind of make sure that, whether, because like a lot of health insurance is paired with your employer. And so if an employer has to kind of keep paying out for somebody who has to go, get they have like heart disease or something, they need to get like a triple bypass surgery, they're out of work for a lot of times. And ultimately kind of, there's all these externalities that kind of will go back into ultimately preventing productivity in their workforce and their community, as well as kind of shifts of money movement from like, things in the local economy to more just medicine. Like, okay, I have to pay, this amount to kind of support my, health issues rather than supporting it. So I think there's a lot of movement towards an economic argument now for preventative medicine, being that it should ultimately be cheaper for society instead of having to have them kind of focus on just like focusing on their, medical bill payments and things like that. So.
Yeah, I think that whole concept of incentives is also really interesting. You mentioned the UW student healthcare plan, like incentivizing people to do exercise and eat healthy, all those things. I think connecting an economic incentive to that sort of aspect of preventative medicine is definitely really effective, and it'd be interesting to see if that can be implemented on a larger scale, like in a big city or something like that, to see how that works. So another policy issue I want to touch upon is So all of you are using technology and various types of data analytics in your research. So given the fact that personalized medicine is increasing prevalence, how do you think that the connection between like privacy and security in the whole context of personalized medicine with access to genomes and everything like that can be ensured? And also another point is, with the use of AI in medicine, the training of AI data sets is obviously biased based on the data that they plug into those programs. So can you touch upon those two aspects and the whole intersection between technology and healthcare?
I
Yeah,
can
so much.
I
I was gonna say,
okay,
Claire's
I'm
going to talk about this one.
Claire's
no,
mess.
no, no,
Yeah.
but I'm not going to start. I'm not going to take AI. I'm not going to do that. I think you two are better equipped to answer AI stuff. But I do have a lot of thoughts on personalized medicine and genetics. So we'll start with AI if that's okay.
Oh, I mean, but like, are you talking about the ethics behind using AI or like at least like the data set? You talk about data sets and how that kind of informs how you do kind of create personalized medicine, right?
Yeah, I guess both. Like the training of data sets, for example, if you only use like white patients, for example, you don't really know the health effects on other demographics, for example. So like those factors also.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a huge push because at least before even the AI started to get on very popular in research, there was a huge issues with GWAS studies, so genome-wide association studies that that was like the big thing like 10, 15 years ago. Okay, if we're going to sequence all the genome, we can start to inform how to we can predict whether this person's going to have diabetes, mental health issues, so forth, and like then we could use that kind of data to predict and like ultimately provide specialized treatments to approach that. But the problem with a lot of genome-wide studies is, like you said, it was very kind of biased to adult white male. Even before genome-wide studies, just medicine in general has been kind of biased towards like adult white males, and so, but we do know growing that there is this disconnect now with like how we treat medicine, because you look at kind of different populations are suffering through like heart disease, suffering through Alzheimer's, suffering through all sorts of different ailments, and that they're not just privileged white males and things like that. And so if you ultimately want to increase the efficacy of treatment and things, you need to have a more diverse sample set. You need to have things that aren't kind of biased in a certain way. And so there has been a lot of efforts through the NIH and NIMH, as well as a lot of other university studies, to promote diverse sample sets, both at the animal model level as well as the human level, to kind of create better predictions and better results. It does also have a cost in kind of trying to get those diverse samples, but at the same time, it ultimately will provide the answers that we need to create the breakthroughs and developments for that.
I think it's important to note too that within AI, it's not just the data set that is coming in that is biased, but the actual AI itself, because it's built by humans. And who are the people who are building AI and what are their biases, because that's going to be a part of the system. And that's one of the things that has been a point of discussion that I think there's more awareness now, but I think certainly there can be better awareness about, I think people have heralded AI as like, this is the unbiased way to do this. And it's like, okay, but like, who built this? A human being did. And therefore, it's, you need to acknowledge and understand what biases are going into the system itself, like the tool, as well as what, sample data is also being used to train it.
Yeah, one thing that I think about a lot is, so when we talk about AI in this context, that technology is being used in the way that it's intended to be used. I mean, the data might be biased or the algorithms might be biased, but that's what the data or the technology is meant to use. What worries me, especially in the neuroscience space, is the misuse of neuroscience technology. The first thing, I use functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, for all of my work. Josh does as well. Claire uses it a little bit as well. So we're familiar with the limitations of things like fMRI, which are typically done in the group context. It's really hard to generalize to an individual person. Our data sets aren't big enough. They're really biased. There's a whole lot of issues with fMRI. We use it in the research context because we're trying to make it better. But the thing that concerns me is using it outside of the research context, specifically in the case of the criminal justice system. And so oftentimes you'll see, a picture of a brain with all these bright colors on it lit up is very convincing to something like a jury. When you say this person's brain is lighting up when it sees this stimulus, and that means that person is going to commit a crime, or that person did commit this crime, or that person's lying. fMRI lie detection is a thing. It's bogus, but the public is generally not educated on that. And so in terms of applying neuroscience technologies outside of research context, there's very few cases in which it's possible to do in an equitable way. And so moving forward, that is something that I'm always trying to keep in mind. And I think, for the public, for you folks, and as you're, talking to your family and friends, if you see a pretty brain image in the paper, just think really, really critically about it, and try to not take everything at face value, because there's a lot of limitations to this method and technology.
I think neuroscience specifically too, we've touched on this. So we host a seminar, like a semester long seminar series where we bring in different speakers. I would also suggest checking out our website, which is mpp.wisc.edu. Does that sound right, Marisa and Josh? Okay, Josh is going to look it up.
I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, cool. So we for the most part record most of our seminars, and we bring in speakers who are of various types of educational backgrounds, have various focuses, but at some point integrate with and intersect with the policy world. And I think with neuroscience, and like specifically because of how new it is so salient to people. It sounds so cool, and it's like, well, it's the brain, so how could this not be real? And yet there is so much nuance lost because it is not as easy as just looking at a brain picture, because right, the brain pictures you look at are not like one person's brain either. A lot of times, right, that you see in papers and stuff like that, it is a mix of things. And so I think within the field of neuroscience specifically, we have a different level of responsibility to ensure that, our stuff is very interesting to the public, and therefore can be used and talked about in ways that are just not correct. And I think that there are times in which this is done intentionally, and I think a lot of times it's done unintentionally, and is done by people who just don't fully grasp what is going on, because that's not their job, and that's not what they've been trained to do. I will touch on genetics and precision medicine, which I think is it's an interesting avenue moving forward, and I think makes a lot of sense by way of all these things that come out about, well, how does the individual respond? I want to just say, like, with precision medicine, I think that this is a very buzzword that gets used a lot, because what's hard to do with precision medicine is what you're talking about is individualized medicine. And that sounds great, and that's awesome. How do you actually test precision medicine? Because all the things that we do with drug testing and, medical treatments and things like that, you are regressing to a mean, right? You are taking an average of all of these people and making assessments based on that. And so when you have an N of 1, what does that look like, right? And so I think that that's something to just keep in mind as these discussions about precision medicine continue, and, in thinking about precision medicine. And that is not me saying that precision medicine is or is not a good thing, but these are just some of the challenges that will come up. Now, with regards to privacy, as it pertains to particularly with like genetic information, there in 2008, I believe, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA, was passed. And what this law says is that an individual cannot be discriminated against for health insurance or in the workplace for finding out their genetic results to something. And so basically, as everything in the policy world, this was a buildup of a lot of iterations of bills to protect people with personal knowledge of their genetic risk for different things. And in my opinion, I think we're about to come up on when this needs to be revisited in a lot of ways. And so I think that there is, as the conversation about around precision medicine and as we're actually able to do precision medicine better, I think that concurrently there needs to be, and there will be an opportunity to strengthen GINA and to take different approaches to ensuring people are protected, because looking at not just breaches of security, but discrimination and how this information can be used to discriminate against people, whether that means they're not getting access to healthcare, whether they're not getting access to life insurance, or, they get fired from their job because, somebody finds out that they have certain number of copies of the Huntington's gene. And, with Huntington's, it's a very clear-cut case, right? When you have a certain number of copies of the Huntington's gene, you will develop it. And the more copies you have, you will develop it earlier. And so that's an anomaly when it comes to genetic type stuff, but is a useful example here. And so I think that there are a lot of avenues for policy to help. And I think that this is an area as well where having people who are trained in science is going to be really critical to making legislation that is holistic and is informed to what the science says. I will say, this is just my personal view, I am really against the direct-to-consumer genetic testing market. So this is things like 23andMe, Ancestry, those types of deals. This is the private market, and they basically, you sign away your rights to your genetic information. In theory, you are able to pull it back, but they have this, and they're able to sell it to pharmaceutical companies for testing, again, also for precision medicine, sort of, but development of drugs and testing and things like that. And it is anonymized, right? But what happens if 23andMe goes bankrupt? What asset do they have to sell? It's people's information. And so these are things that I'm thinking about, and that's not to say I'm the only person thinking about it at all. I do think that this is going to be, I think, kind of one of the next big waves with concerns about privacy and thinking about the intersection of health, science, industry, private industry, and government, and how these things are interfacing. And I think it'll be really, I'm really curious to see how that's going to go out, and who is going to have a lot of leverage, like what the specific concern is going to be. Because if it is concern from constituents about their privacy, right, you can imagine that the issue, right, is going to be, okay, well, how do we protect consumers? Or is it going to be leveraged that, it has something to do with industry, and industry is pulling money into the equation of, trying to get access to certain things. So I think that privacy, as we also are just in a more and more virtual space, and as we collect more and more data, I can't speak, right? I'm not a computer science person, so I can't speak to the actual systems we use to store personal health information, or PHI. What I do know is that there is a need to update those systems, because there will always be people who are able to hack into those systems and have malintent for what they want to do with that information. So there's also a lot of different avenues with regards to security of that information.
Yeah, so another up and coming topic in genetics and health is the use of genetic editing or genetic engineering to solve things like neurodegenerative diseases or other issues in neurology. So what do you think are the proper ethics behind these? Do you have any view on what are the limitations that we should or that we can do with these types of new techniques that are emerging in the field?
I feel like we've had plenty of topics past with discussions. There's been a lot of talk about CRISPR-Cas9 was a very popular, and it's still very popular genetic editing tool. And I think actually 2018 was when there was this international kind of consortium congress on like, we know that this technology exists now. We know that people would be really eager to do all these kind of genetic testing or genetic editing in both, good and also nefarious ways. And so I think it's really like where policy starts to come into play, whether or not like, how do we consider the ethics behind new technology, especially when we don't quite understand it, we don't quite know the downstream effect that this may have. And I think, and we're clarifying Marisa and Claire, is like, I think the two rules really is like, you don't want to necessarily take away loss of normal function, as well as you don't want to increase function. So the example of that is probably easy. Is like, how do you weaponize like gene editing? How can you create soldiers that never get tired, never need sleep, heal really quickly, blah blah, and just like know how to follow orders. Like, and then you can theoretically create genes to do that. And so I think that's the big scary part with gene editing, is like what can you weaponize it, as well as on the other hand, like how do you create the super babies, the ones that have the perfect features, super smart, all these kind of various, and like how does that also may contribute to more inequality down the line. You have families saying like, okay, I want this 6'4" basketball player who like can get like a PhD rocket science, blah blah blah, and like I'll pay you $50,000 or $100,000 to do that. And so you start to and then you create these there's a lot of like worries I have about it, but I mean at this point we're not at that level to do this kind of things. Like there has been like some efforts into deleting harmful kind of disease related genes, or at least kind of fixing some of those, which looks promising. But at this point we're not at the point now where we can make super babies yet, but we should use policy at this point in case that technology does exist down the line, that there are good checks and balances to how you approach those, and like accountability. And so this requires not only like a US centric but also international cooperation. And so I think when we talk about policy, obviously like we're in the US, we're all like PhD students in the US, but in reality science is not bounded by your country. It is across the world. And so you got to have a good way to communicate how and why we want these policies to exist for the safety of not only our field but also society and whatnot.
Yeah, I think those are all very important points. I think I've heard scientists describe as the 21st century or the century of engineering biology. So I think the whole field of bioengineering and genetic engineering is very important in the next frontier in biology. And I think the points you brought up of the regulation behind that is essential to ensure that people don't abuse it and that we use it in the right way. So any other points on that topic?
I just want to emphasize, Josh said basically the things that I was going to say, which is considerations for equity and justice regarding who has access to technology and what it's used for, as well as just being very, very clear about the limitations of the technology. Currently, it is only really used in animals. I know there are some examples of, a muscular disorder that CRISPR has been used for in humans, but generally it is only in animals. And back to Claire's original point at the very beginning, who was in the room when these policies regarding regulation of genetic technologies are being made? Scientists should 100% be in the room for that, because otherwise we will see inequities. We will see people who don't know anything about this trying to control what scientists can do, and that just prevents what we can learn, and just snowballs into bad things. So yeah, considerations for justice and equity, as well as just being very clear about the limitations of the technology, are my biggest concerns.
Yeah, the additional thing I'll emphasize from what Josh said too, that I think is science does not exist in a vacuum. And this is in all spaces, right? People will say, well, science shouldn't be political. Science is inherently political. It's not partisan, because science is not trying to propagate one party's agenda over another, but it is political because it can be used in ways to propagate a message. But even further, I think in science not existing in a vacuum, what we're doing here has ripple effects in other places. And the science that is being done in other places has ripple effects on us. And so one of the things we've talked about in our group as well is talking about the ways in which scientific regulations are different in other countries. And so the US is pretty conservative when it comes to stem cell research. And so we've talked about what kind of inhibition of intellectual growth has happened here in the United States because of these restrictions we've put on stem cell research. And how does this shape also like the culture that we're a part of? How does that shape the types of questions we're asking and the approaches we're doing, as opposed to being in the same field but approaching it differently because of being a part of a different culture and having different norms and also different restrictions on science.
Yeah, those are really great points to bring up as well. So switching to a slightly different topic. So nowadays, young people like high schoolers and people in that demographic in particular are very active and increasingly want to be active in the field of public policy. And I and most of the other Simply Neuroscience members are in high school. So how do you think that high schoolers and young people can get involved in public policy and the intersections of science and public policy? And how do you think that they can pursue that as they progress older and get into their careers?
If you've got the time, I know all high school situations are different. You might be working, you might be in sports, you might be all these other things, but really just my number one piece of advice is to volunteer where you can in a variety of different areas. So maybe volunteer at your local food bank so you can get a sense of what types of social services are available in your area, what needs are available in your area. You could volunteer with a lab, maybe, if they, to get a sense if you're interested in doing research. You could volunteer with a local campaign, whether that's like school board or city council, or if it's an election season and you want to get involved with knocking doors for a political candidate. Just when you do have time, try to figure out what your interests are in the policy sphere, because not everybody's are going to be the same and not every experience is going to be the same. And I know, telling people to spend more time on things is probably not the best piece of advice, but especially in a virtual environment, maybe you could spend a little bit more just like Googling and searching places where you can meet with people online, just trying to get an idea of what's out there and what your interests are.
I think in to add to what Marisa said is also having an attitude of just openness, because with regards to public affairs and policy, that is the underlying current of our lives, right? Policy shapes most of how we interact and what we are and are not able to do. And so there are so many different avenues to be involved in policy that may not look like it. And so I think exploring what that looks like and taking different opportunities, because you're at a point where you have the flexibility to try different things, and also don't feel like just because you started something you have to stick with it and finish it, because if you don't like something, stop doing it. don't feel like you have to keep doing something, because as you progress further into your educational careers and when you're thinking about just the life that you want to build for yourself, I think it's important to think about what your values are, your priorities, and making sure that your activities are aligned to that. And that's going to change across time and as you get older and have different opportunities, but being able to tell a story about how you got to where you are. At the beginning of this, right, when the three of us were talking about how essentially we ended up in neuroscience and public policy, it sounds nice, right? It sounds clean. It sounds like this was the plan all along. And it wasn't for any of us. We all, in some way, shape, or form, happened into the neuroscience and public policy program. That doesn't mean it didn't require a lot of work and effort. But point being is, you are at a point in your lives where there are so many opportunities and different avenues for you to explore. So really do that and really think to yourself, am I doing this because I think it's going to look good? Or am I doing this because it is something that I feel good doing. It is aligned with my values and is also helping me get to be where I want to be.
Yeah, to piggyback off of that, I to kind of reiterate what Claire says. Yeah, like if you don't like something, don't keep doing it because you think you should be doing it. I feel like even though I'm kind of like, I like the journey that I've had more or less, and there's a lot of hardship regarding kind of getting to a place like this, especially making that kind of career change, I guess, from wanting to go to medical school to go into PhD, which is a lot more kind of unknown, is to kind of be flexible. Like the fact that you're even kind of thinking about this, it's amazing. Like as a high schooler, like I barely knew anything about what policy was. Even after college, I barely knew what policy was. Like I only took like one political science class in college. And so like, yeah, being open-minded to what you want to do, and whether it's what you do now, if you're really interested now, if that you keep building up, or just being open-minded to other things. And so having an open mind, having that kind of flexibility is really important, as well as trying to get as many opportunities as you can given your schedule and kind of mental health. But don't go crazy over it. Like don't get too stressed out right now, because policy is stressful. It can be very, very what's the word for it? Discouraging sometimes, especially the past, a couple of years, and just the unsure state of the world, whatever. But I mean, as long as we have like young people like you guys that are kind of bring it back, try to like get more involved with things, there should be like a very hopeful future for like all of us in your future career path.
I think too, not like viewing things as existing in silos, because while that may be true, you can build a bridge to bring things together. And so doing one thing does not inherently mean that you can't do something else and pull these things together. And so I think about that as well, that I think about just high school. I really loved my AP US Gov and AP US History courses, classes that I took, and I was like, but I'm not gonna do something with that in college, and then here I am with a master's in public affairs. That's not anything that I thought was possible when I was in high school, but is. And so really stay true to what you're interested in, because you are only limited by your imagination and what exists. And I think we are coming up on an era where there's going to be a bit of a breakdown, and these things have to be separate, and instead being able to really pull everything together and to take from different spaces, and being a well-rounded human being and taking from your different interests and putting them together.
And I'll just add to cap this off, like, do not be hesitant to ask people for help or advice or thoughts. I'm not going to speak for Claire or Josh, but I am more than happy to stay connected with you all, share my email address if anyone is interested. Just keeping up that network, which I hate using that term because I'm looking for a job and everything's about a network, and it's a little bit like a little bit triggering for me, but it really is what, building a network, bothering people. You're not bothering people. Send an email. If they don't respond, feel free to email again. Just be persistent, and people generally will want to speak with you and will want to help you. So just keep that in mind. Do not be afraid to reach out if you're really passionate about what someone is doing.
Yeah, that's all really great advice. I think as long as someone's persistent and ambitious, I think that they can achieve anything that they set out to do. So I think that's all definitely very good advice. Do any of the audience members have questions? Catherine or Jenna or Davis, any questions?
I just wanted to say thank you guys so much for coming and speaking. I learned so much today.
Yeah, thank you all so much for coming. It was really nice learning from all of you.
Yeah, of course. Josh and I put our emails in the chat. Claire put hers in there as well. So feel free to contact us if anything else comes up. And really excited to see what you all are doing here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, have a nice day, and hope to see you again at future Symphony Neuroscience events as well.
Sounds good.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Good luck, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.